Good morning, everyone. If we could just take our seats. I know we've just had coffee, so we're all energized for the second session. The topic for our second session is cohesive diversity. This really builds on the discussion in the first panel when we talked about good politics, as Warren described it. Now, Singapore has evolved significantly. Our traditional divides of race, religion, language, these have changed significantly in the last years. Now, Singapore society is looking at the inequality of wealth distribution, the influx of foreigners, the divide between the young and old, intermarriages, issues surrounding LGBT rights, whether a children's book about two male penguins raising a baby chick is suitable reading material for our young, whether counting down to the new year being entertained by Adam Lambert is suitable, and whether junior colleges should be named Eunoia or Ionoia. These fault lines really challenge the cohesiveness and tolerance and open space that our society has enjoyed over the last 50 years. Will the diversity lead to greater division, or will we eke out the strengths that diversity brings with it? We need to explore the Singapore model on how to deal with this and overcome the challenges posed by diversity. I have with me a distinguished panel. Let me start by introducing the speaker for today, Mr. Ng Chee Meng. He's the Acting Minister for Education and concurrently Senior Minister of State for Transport. And before joining Cabinet, he was Singapore's Chief of Defence Force. To my left, I have Professor David Chan, Lee Kuan Yew Fellow and Director of the Behavioural Sciences Institute at the Singapore Management University. Associate Professor Elaine Ho, who is from the Geography Department at the National University of Singapore. And Mr. Hassan Ahmad, who is the Executive Director of the Corporate Citizen Foundation. This is a private sector alliance targeted at regional humanitarian missions. I welcome the panel and our speaker, and could have a round of applause for them. I'll now hand over to Chee Meng for his opening remarks.
Professor Wang Keng Wu, Chairman of the Governing Board of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Professor Tommy Koh, Special Advisor to IPS, Janadas, Director of the Institute of Policy Studies. My friends, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you. I'm very delighted to be here this morning to share my thoughts with you and, more importantly, to hear your perspectives as one Singapore. The term cohesive diversity, according to Mr. Ho Kwon Peng, is a delightful oxymoron, and indeed it is so. But this morning, I shan't go too much into the English of it. Diversity in itself is actually a neutral concept. It simply means variety. Therefore, the merits or pitfalls of diversity are context-specific. For example, in an organization, diversity can be a source of strength because from this diversity, different ideas, different viewpoints can be put on the table, and the resultant decision would most likely benefit from this plethora of viewpoints from the marketplace. However, this is assuming that after the decision is made, all would rally behind the decision. But in the very same example, what if even after the decision is taken, different parties don't quite buy in and continue to pull in different directions? Then the very same diversity divides. Therefore, whether diversity brings strength or whether diversity divides depends not only in the thinking, but also in the doing. As such, harnessing diversity for strength involves both ideation and also unity of action. Likewise for Singapore, where there is more than one social, cultural, or economic group, including racial and religious groups, diversity can either be a good thing or a bad thing. In our history, as some of you older gentlemen and ladies have lived through, we have had to manage significant tensions where diversity led to social unrest. In our earlier years, Singapore faced racial riots, intra-racial riots, ideological differences that threatened to pull our society apart. But over the last 50 years, we have rallied together and forged what I can probably call cohesive diversity in Singapore today. Singapore's cohesive diversity actually started out as a vision, an ideation, crystallized in our pledge. In our earlier years, the pledge emerged as we struggled to forge a sense of national identity, a sense of nationhood. We pledged ourselves first as a united people and committed to build a nation regardless of race, language, or religion. Our founding fathers believed that race, language, and religion had the potential to divide, and the late Mr. Rajaratnam wrote the pledge to call upon Singaporeans to be united and overcome these differences or diversities as we build a common future together as one united people. So getting the vision right is very important, but the vision alone would not have led us to where we are today as a one Singapore. So what did? In my view, it is in large part due to our inclusive politics and policies that drove us towards this vision. These are careful policies, deliberate policies, practical, pragmatic policies. Our politics did not shy away from difficult decisions to create common spaces for all groups to live, work, and play together. Common spaces that we should continue to guard jealously. These policies create, enlarge, and defend our common spaces, and they are not static. These policies will evolve over time, even as our society evolves and matures. Today, more of us are championing causes we believe in, causes such as environmental sustainability, animal rights, and so forth. As we globalize, income inequality would remain an issue. Singaporeans ourselves are also becoming more diverse due to more interracial marriages and maybe even immigration. The texture of our society has become more complex, and the idea of multiculturalism has become more nuanced. We want Singaporeans to care about our community and to serve. And we want Singaporeans who choose to believe in Singapore and believe in making a difference here. The challenge is, will we be able to continue to progress towards our vision of one united people, even as we appear to be more different and diverse? Our vision has not changed, as I've spoken to many Singaporeans, but even as we disagree on issues, we agree on one thing: our common vision, as in our pledge, one united people. What will make a real difference is how we continue with our inclusive politics and policies. These policies, as I've said, may change over time, but the core elements such as education, meritocracy, and leaving no Singaporean behind must remain. As a society, Singaporeans must respect our differences and proactively defend our common spaces, regardless of whether we are Singapore-born or new citizens, regardless of religion, and regardless of whether we are rich or poor. Our integration and naturalization champions actively reach out to the new citizens and PRs. And over time, these new citizens and PRs can contribute more to our community and at the same time expand their social network. And I'm quite glad to see that we are on the right track. Back when I was in the SAF, as we set up the SAF volunteer corps, well, it attracted a lot of interest. I recall a particular gentleman, a Singaporean PR, who wanted to sign up as a volunteer. Why? because he gets a little, I quote, he gets a little jealous of the common bond that Singaporean males share as national servicemen. So even as we welcome new PRs or new citizens, in this diversity, we are already creating bonds. On the way forward, we will continue to refine our Singapore approach to diversity. It is not just going to be through government policies, but I think it will be through inclusive politics, as I said earlier. Every Singaporean will have a part to play. Our community will have a part to play. And in the true spirit of drawing strength from diversity, I would very much like to hear your views later. I hope it won't be a monologue where I answer your questions only. And really, conversations about diversities, we all know can be emotionally charged, especially among those who view it as a zero-sum game. How can we have these conversations in an informed and constructive manner, where viewpoints, whether you are in the majority or in the minority, are respected and properly considered? In some sensitive areas, there may be no definitive consensus today, even as we recognize that a new equilibrium may be needed in the future. What do we, as a society, need to do in that process of evolution and transition? How can we be more resilient as one united people, harness the strengths from our diversity and never allow it to pull us apart? How can we galvanize individuals, including all of you, all of us here in this room today, in our call to action to help society find balance amidst the diversity of views, amidst a rapidly changing world? I look forward to hearing your views. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. I would like to invite the panel to make a few comments and also to ask questions that they might have of Minister. We'll start with David.
Thanks, Minister and Chairman. I think most of us can agree on the good things. You know, diversity is both a strength and a weakness depending how you do it. We need to be united and so on. I think the challenge for a conference like this and also for the public discourse is how to do it. I think what should be done is relatively clear. If you do a survey, probably at least 9 out of 10, at least 9 meaning is 90% will actually agree with some of the basic principles on what is good. I think the how is the difficult part. I think there is some hope, not just because of the vote in the GE, but I think there's a more informed public discussion and more people are more able and willing to speak up on how to do certain things. I think the challenge is for both the leadership and the various stakeholders to understand what do we mean by the positive and negatives of diversity. The negatives can be actually explosive. As we can see, many of the sectoral fights, terrorism, actually come from failure to appreciate how different social identities can coexist. I think we need to be quite aware of the negatives as we pursue the positives. At the same time, the positives are aspirational, and if we don't pursue it, I think we will just become isolated pockets. Staying within Singapore, and that's not going to be very helpful when something negative really happens. Right, so with that brief comment, I thought I just want to first agree with the Minister that when a decision is made, we got to kind of like live with it and rally behind the decision. I'd just like to add though that the decision needs to be adaptive. After the decision has been made, we must be able and ensure that processes allow the recognition that the decision need to change after a while. And when that happens, the trick is for the leadership to ensure that, well, it is not necessarily a U-turn, but how we need to now make the decision a little bit differently. I think that kind of dynamism, that kind of leadership and trust is very important. The second point I think about after a decision has been made that we need to rally behind is not to forget the decision-making process. One of the reasons that people don't rally behind the decision is usually not the decision itself, but the process in which the decision is arrived. And then those of us know about outcome fairness is one thing, the process fairness is another. So focusing on the fairness of the process, I think it becomes critical. And within that context, I would also argue that the pledge is very important. I recite it, you recite it, but we are Singaporeans. If you throw a ball when you get out of this room and it falls on somebody's head, actually the chances it falls on a Singaporean is 6 out of 10, because 4 out of 10 are non-citizens. And with that in mind, I don't think it's quite possible to use our national pledge to speak to the 4 out of 10, because they are not citizens. So I think we need to be a bit careful that while Singaporeans can adhere to the pledge, the national anthem, the way we are brought up, recognize that the 4 out of 10 may need a different approach. And that means we need to think through what are some of the unifying concepts to address diversity, at least for the 4 out of 10, if not 10 out of 10. And I would suggest we think about the concept of home. Minister spoke about the PR wanting to do military, quite an extreme example, but I'm sure there are also other examples. And I would argue that if you look at that positively, it's because the PR thought this is a good home away from home. This is a good second home. So whether you are a single, and then you don't have the idea that we talked about this morning, that I want my children to do better because you are single, you don't have children, you know. So, and then there's quite a number of singles around. So whether you are single, you are married, you are citizens, you are PR, or you are non-citizens, I think the idea that can Singapore be your home within a community can be a unifying concept. So you can think about here as home away from home, a good home, and for Singapore, of course, this is your home. And when you are away, you think about coming back home. I think the idea of home within a community is something that we need to think through a little bit more and give it a little bit more weightage. And when the community thinks that is the context in which you have your home, the idea that you will speak up, the idea that you will just not talk but take action becomes real. So this is one of several, I think, ideas that we can, several ways that we can make ideas into action. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Minister, would you like to take up any of those points about adaptive decisions, the decision-making process being fair, and using more than the pledge as a tool to measure?
Humans have different levels of identities. So in many ways, I agree with what David has said. Our pledge appeals to Singaporeans because it started with the premise, we, the citizens of Singapore. It appeals to the 60-70% of us in this geographical location called the state of Singapore. So in that, using the pledge to rally 70% of our people is not a trivial one. While if you can recall the National Day celebrations, we do have Kit Chan singing Home. In parallel, we can appeal to different levels of identification. As an individual, as a father, I have a different identity. The Ng clan has a certain identity of heritage. As a community, we have different identities. So I don't look at it as a 0-1 appeal towards rallying a sense of home or a Singapore heartbeat. It is through different policies, different hands, different initiatives that over longer periods of time that forge identities. But at the end of it all, when we discuss Singapore perspectives, which is the prevalent and dominant identity we want to cultivate, I would submit to all of us that it will be a Singapore shared identity, a national identity. Because for the next 50 years, there will be many, many challenges that will abound. Some we can see in the short term. There will be many challenges that are beyond the horizon at the moment. How do we have the fabric that will hold us together with common ideals, a common vision that not just only appeals to the intellect, but appeals to all the different levels of the makeup of a human being? So I agree with what you have said in many, many ways, but I would like to expand the space in which we discuss cohesive diversity. Because if we narrow it too much, ironically, there's no diversity or possibilities.
Thank you, Minister.
Elaine.
Thank you, Walter and Minister. So I want to talk a bit about this idea of we, and also building on David's metaphor of home, which as a geographer I appreciate very much. I think when we talk about we in this age of globalization, especially in the case of Singapore as a global city-state, it may not be sufficient to only think about it in terms of citizenship status. So we have I think citizenship is about a process. And so for people who are born in Singapore and have grown up in Singapore, perhaps it's more natural to identify as a citizen. But in that process of identifying as a citizen ourselves, we also create othering kind of categories. So for example, Singaporean-born citizens may not be so welcoming towards new citizens and even towards PRs. And I think in some of our policies, we are starting to see a sharpening divide between foreigners, citizens, and PRs. So my worry is that that type of categorizations actually could impede the integration of new citizens and PRs. And I think I also want to bring up the CMIO model, Chinese, Malay, Indian, others model that have been the typical approach in which we approach governance and policy making in Singapore. So the CMIO model filters into housing, into education, and more. However, I question if this model is still capacious enough to accommodate the greater diversity in Singapore today. So we see the others category expanding at an accelerated rate. And then at the same time, the irony is within the Chinese and the Indian categories, we see growing differentiations with new migrants coming from China and from South Asia. So I wonder if the CMIO model is actually still a good way for us to think about managing ethnicity and the intersecting types of identities, that different kinds of people converging in Singapore today may have.
Elaine, I'll just challenge you on that. Do you have an alternative to the CMIO model?
In terms of the CMIO model, well, personally, I think that the CMIO model has served its purpose. I mean, it's probably been about 50 years now, and I would actually like to see these categorizations dissolved more so. I realize that we do have mixed race categories now, but that is another form of categorization.
Okay, Minister, dissolve the CMIO model.
Well, thank you, Elaine. Well, again, it comes back to how human beings actually identify ourselves. From the earliest seeds of civilization, where we belong to a small group of hunter-gatherers, to civilization today. Humans do not exist just as individuals, even as we exist as individuals. We find solace in groups, in clans, develop into villages, develop into kingdoms, industrial age revolution that redefine human organization, human governance, and to today, where the information technology revolution is outpacing governance, the models of governance. When you look back at this long history of human civilization, well, we've got to ask ourselves, will we be in our ideation, even as we desire to nuance the differences of CMIO, would it be possible and practicable? This idea actually Kong Peng spoke about in the series of lectures he had. And after a while, with his own conversations with his friends that are minorities, actually, he said that what he said probably wasn't the most circumspect. Because when we talk to our friends who are in the minority, if we were to remove this, how would it impinge on their rights? When we want to blur it as a majority race in Singapore, if we were to blur it, who would represent their interests? How would we design inclusive politics to make sure that my Malay brethren is represented in Parliament? How would we create policies that would ensure that my Indian brethren will be represented in Parliament? So while the ideals of expanding or doing away with this, I think we have to match with the realities of life as we see it. Between the ideals and the practicalities of politics, how do we find the path forward? So I would be very, very careful to move away from principles that have served us very well for so long. Is there space for evolution? I fully agree with you that we should continue to think about this space for evolution. So if I'm not mistaken, before I have joined government, Our government has also now explored giving parents the choice to put their children in whatever category of race when the child is born. Is it a big dramatic step? Well, arguably no. But is it an evolution of looking at CIMO in a different light? I'll say yes. So some of these things, I think, would evolve some evolution, and you must give it time. Yeah?
Elaine, is that enough for you? Being able to label your children Chinese, Indian?
Sorry, I can't really hear you.
Is that answer sufficient? Are you happy just being able to name your children Chinese,
Well,
Indian?
if I may follow up in that case, since you asked.
Yes.
We talk about minority representation, but with the changing demographics in Singapore, we have an increasing number of minorities. And I think that while we may privilege certain types of identities that are tied to being so-called maybe we can say the pioneer ethnic categories, the Chinese, Malay, Indian, others. So these are the ethnic categories that emerged from the time when Singapore became independent to today. But now with a growing range of minority populations, how do we then also represent these other kinds of ethnic groups that are congregating in Singapore today?
Okay, this is quite a specific question, Minister.
Well, in our system, civic society conversations like this, in our own political system, in the GRC system, it's all designed to have minorities incorporated so that there will always be voices other than the majority in government. But looking even beyond this specific design of our GRC system, if you could recall Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's words, this is not a Chinese nation, this will not be a Chinese nation, this will not be an Indian nation, this will not be a Malay nation. We are all in it together. I think under the umbrella of a principled approach to inclusive politics is where we find a space. And as I said, it is a long journey ahead for the next 50 years for us to consider. And within this principle, where can we find the nuanced policies to allow evolution, to allow space for these discussions to find a new water level? I think that would be probably the better approach towards such sensitive areas.
Thank you, Minister. Hassan, jump in.
Thank you, Walter.
Can I just interrupt for a minute?
Sorry.
This is really not the best way to have a conversation. Maybe I should just stand up so that we can, in the spirit of cohesive diversity, really engage in conversation.
So we also stand.
I feel some pressure to stand up as well, but I don't have a mic.
Do you want us to mingle as well?
I can't even see you when you talk, and I hear all kinds of echoes up here. So come, Hassan.
Come, Hassan.
Sorry, just to add, so I think we've got decent politics and sound policies all these years that have allowed for harmonious coexistence, which includes interracial and interreligious relations. And this is in line with the spirit of what our founding Prime Minister said, everyone shall have a place in this country. The Singapore model has worked really well in the Global Religious Diversity Report, right? Ranked Singapore as the most diverse in terms of religions out of 232 countries. And PM Lee said that this is an unusual and unnatural state of affairs. So we know that the Singapore model has worked tremendously well. But of course, we are also under no delusions that Singapore is vulnerable. It remains vulnerable. We remain vulnerable in terms of the things that are happening around us. And of course, there is also no guarantee of harmony, sustained harmony amongst us. What more should we do now? And especially given that there is increasing religiosity, increasing migration, this will also increase the challenge or the challenges of interfaith and also intrafaith. So how do we engage the different strata of society? I think everybody needs to be educated. We can't take things for granted. Everybody knows we can't be complacent, right? Interestingly, the schools have started social studies as a compulsory together with humanities. Back in the 80s, when I was in secondary school, we have to do religious knowledge. So, you being from the education ministry, are we ready to inject inter-religious knowledge into the syllabus or the curriculum for the O's and A levels? And also, from the military, are we ready to also inject inter-religious knowledge as part of the curriculum for our NS men, reservists, and also the active units, Minister?
Well, I would not go into a content-specific answer because this is really not a forum for policy making, but maybe just when you ask those questions, while I've said that the pledge rallied, we didn't quite explore why did we succeed? Well, why did inclusive politics succeed? I think over the last 50 years, as I said, once certain personalities have put forth a certain ideal for us to go through, Singapore rallied together really as one people. Within the space, there were a lot of agreements and disagreements. But over 50 years, one of the invaluable things in our society is trust. Trust between the people and the government. Why would some community subjugate their interests for the wider good? Because they can see the validity of the vision and they trust that in action consistently over time, the government has the ability, the integrity, and probably most importantly, the track record over periods of time, over different crises, different contingencies. They've been tested, and we have come forth to hold on to those ideals by our record. So, thank you. It's actually okay.
You had something.
So this is more a conversation, don't you think? Thank you. So, the specific issues about whether education can play a role, I definitely think so. But whether we should reintroduce religious studies, interracial studies, and the plethora of diversities of issues, well, I think we can think about it. But under the compulsory education design of MOE, we actually brought together disparate schools in 1959, where we had Malay schools, Indian schools, Chinese schools that were pulling us apart. And when we went into compulsory education with a common system for 6 years, it allowed our children, or my time, me, to play, study, and sometimes fight, sometimes cry together with my friends in the Malay community, in the Indian community, so on and so forth. So that 6 years that we have put into the system is known but not widely appreciated. That we find a balance between forging a national identity for the first 6 years in primary education and then variegating our system out into different systems to allow Singaporeans with unique talents, with different levels of abilities to explore and chase their rainbows. So within this, even in the education system, you can see a delicate balance between forging identity, which in some ways is uniformity, and allowing the strengths of diversity to come through and allow Singapore society to function at some optimal balance. Will this balance change over the next 50 years? Probably so, but it will be contextualized to that generation to see how we would find that equilibrium that will suit Singapore and Singaporeans best at that time. Does that answer your question? Okay. Thanks, Hassan. Now I don't know whether to stand or sit.
Can I get audio on this one? Did you get me in the back? Yeah.
So structure makes a difference in meaningful conversations.
So, to have meaningful conversations, I'm going to stand. I think in the first panel, we didn't get a chance to hear as much from the audience as we'd like to. I'm going to throw it open to the floor now. I see a hand raised straight away. So, could someone get a mic up here? Sorry, we've taken all the cordless mics in the room. No, we're going to find one for him. Otherwise, I'm going to come down there and stand next to you, Zul. Looks like I have to.
I'll just borrow some space, David. Yeah.
Oh, good, we found one.
Minister, Singapore is a predominantly Chinese country. It will continue to be a predominantly Chinese country. This morning we heard about collaborative government, and you spoke about inclusiveness and diversity. And I think we have arrived where we are because of very extraordinary measures, the legislative and political, which defies any definition you see elsewhere in the world, such that we do not suffer from the tyranny of majoritism. We may suffer from it in the future if we're not careful, which means we have to make more extraordinary measures in the future so that the minority do not just have a proportional influence, which is small, but I think continue to enjoy a special place in Singapore. So as a member of the future leadership, I would like to know what are the extraordinary things that you think we should continue to do so that both you don't end up collaborators being very comfortable on their own and compromise the interests of the minority who have all along been part and parcel of a larger Chinese Singapore community. Thank you.
Well, that's a very good question. I think in this, the structures are somewhat designed and serving us reasonably well. The processes would be really the focal point in the way forward. How do we ensure that Zainal Sapari, my colleague in my GRC, comes together with us to discuss things? In the process, how do we actually formulate the way forward together? Not so much as making extraordinary concessions or extraordinary treatments, but as one entity as a polity, how do we engage in the process? That what the President has also said as the last point, engaging Singaporeans and together owning the very policies that we'll design for the future. I think that is probably the method forward. Specifically, were certain issues to surface, then I think having different representation to articulate our viewpoints would be very, very important. Not so much the structures that I think has served us quite well, but in the process, in this period of time. Okay, come.
Other questions? Yes. Okay, we have the missing mic again.
Name is Sui Che from NTUC Enterprise. I was encouraged by the previous question because my question has the same context but a slightly different take. Firstly, Janadas this morning explained very clearly the importance of perpetuating our shared identity, which means deepening our shared context as Singaporeans, as a citizenship. But of course, you are competing against other shared identities, be it being a Muslim, we see a tremendous rise in its militancy throughout the world, be it Christian conservatism or liberalism or Indian nationalism if India is to emerge in the next 50 years. So that is the background in which the new leadership have to take Singapore. So my argument is not just about process, right? It is about how Singapore became so extraordinary in the first 50 years. It was a remarkable reflection of an extraordinary leadership. So what kind of leaders do we need? coming to the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? Is it the kind of leadership we see in Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, or is it a more consultative, inclusive leadership of Goh Chok Tong, or more cerebral leadership? Do we need good economists, or do we need good union leaders? What kind of leadership do we need? So I want to hear your response to it, because I think, as you mentioned or you implied earlier, the personalities give us this. So what kind of personalities do we need? Because I think that is a quite important question.
Yep, good question. It is not, in my view, the most complete question, because in Mr. Lee's era, cohesive diversity was not real. The tensions in society were pulling us apart. So what kind of leadership do we need in that period? Consultative? Would they have worked as well? I don't know, because we can't wind back the clock. We can only have an intellectual argument. But as we succeeded together as a country, where Singaporeans became better educated, with good viewpoints, with good ideas, how then do we evolve our leadership style as a government? Then I think Mr. Goh's era, where it became more consultative, was the best way forward. In the next 50 years, I think personally that this dimension of consultative leadership, co-ownership of our outcomes, will be even more important. So in each era, we don't just put a form of style of leadership into a specific vacuum. We need to understand what is the context and therefore find the best way forward. I think it's quite common in Singapore for all Singaporeans to know what Mr. Lee Kuan Yew has done for us. We appreciate what he has done, but many of us in ideas today would want our voices to be heard so that we can participate. And at this stage of our country's evolution, well, I'm glad that we have almost 1,500 people here, that we can collectively speak in a rational manner without charged emotions to find out who thinks what, how can we think better, and then ultimately, how do we design policies that will move us collectively forward, coming back to the pledge, as one united people, and within that space, understanding and having the humility to know that my view may not be the primary view. It is one of a plethora of views, and after long or short consultation, depending on context again, what decision is taken, and whether we will have that overarching identity to move ourselves forward as Singapore in the sense of sometimes subjugating your view beneath someone else's. So in the conversations that we have, it's not about winning the argument. I personally would very much want to hear the best argument and then formulate my position, not the other way around. I don't come here with a position to push. I come here in a nice environment like this with the luxury of time to hear and find the best position. But if I would go back into my previous profession as the Chief of Defence Force in crisis, I may not have the luxury of time. And therefore, we do all the preparatory work, all the exercises to think through as many things as possible. But when it's time to call, when it's a call for action, without the luxury of time, then, well, let's do it together, respect the decision, and go forth. We have this range of possibilities.
In the interest of keeping this a conversation, I'd put that same question to David as well. The type of leadership that you expect to see, the question that was asked from the floor.
Well, expect to see, maybe I would say what kind of leadership I want. Expect to see is quite a different question from what the leadership I want, right? So I think the leadership I want, and I hope you want, and I'm sure Minister want too, is one that is principled and adaptive. right? Principled and adaptive. Now, I don't include the word pragmatic in there because it's arguable whether pragmatic is a principle or not, right? So if you include in it, it becomes PAP, principle and pragmatic. So you put in principle it can be inclusive enough to include pragmatism as one of the principles. But I think the important thing, it means that you translate that into individuals. You know, the people on the ground, walking on the street, watching television, don't use words like pragmatism and principle, right? They look at who you are, which means they use words like, are you competent? Do you have character? So I think competence and character are the two main things that you must never give up. Now, of course, we can debate what is character, what is competence, actual, perceive, and all, but those are fundamentals that must remain. But please allow me to say something about CMIO.
Very quickly, please, David.
Very quickly, I just want to remind ourselves that we all have social identities. I'm Singaporean, Chinese, I'm male, and so on. So our social identities get activated, and I can't change my race. So I think be a little bit careful when we talk about the CMIO, because there are some things that are fundamental. You are born with, you can't change. It comes with a certain context. We didn't choose to be of a particular sex or race and so on. And it becomes important that such ascribed status that we are born with must not have a policy whereby they end up to be disadvantaged or advantaged. You know, if you don't want to talk about male and female, there will be no women's charter. So similarly, if you do not want to talk about CMIO, then we need to ask what kind of policies, which means has to be erased. Is it good or bad? I think that kind of thinking is important. And you separate that from the fact that CMIO, is it impeding national identity? I don't think so. All the national survey shows that I can be very Malay and I can be very Singaporean and so on. And these are anonymous surveys, so people are not trying to be socially desirable. So I think bear in mind when we say do away with CMIO, what are we doing away with? I'm not saying that everything is fine, but be careful what we are doing away with. Yeah.
If I just take that point a little bit further, in my younger days, I think many of us identify ourselves first as Chinese Singaporean, Malay Singaporean, Indian Singaporean. Today, when I interact with folks on the ground, almost unanimously, I'm a Singaporean Chinese, I'm a Singaporean Indian, I'm a Singaporean Malay. So the CMIO model and the way that we have gone about it has actually, at two levels, at the highest level, forged the national identity because of the rallying call of the pledge. At the second order level, we have continued to allow, encourage the propagation of our unique cultures and heritage so that we draw strength from the diversity of our heritage. We are not quite like the Americans where we want to assimilate and produce Singaporean that is non-Chinese, non-Malay, non-Indian, but Singaporean. And I think this is a stated policy, that we want to have the cake, basically, and eat it. To have the diversity of our heritage back to whichever ancestry, build those strengths, and at the same time, build a new sense of nationhood. And largely, I think, the CMIO model functioning at the second layer, whether it's in our education system, our housing policies, have largely succeeded with somewhat more of a retrospective credit, perhaps, of rallying ourselves together as a country with the pledge as the rallying call.
Minister, just to prevent Elaine from kicking David under the table, I'm going to give her a chance to address these points.
Right. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I agree that the CMIO model has served us well, and it's enabled us to forge a strong national identity. But I also am concerned that the CMIO model has become sedimented to such an extent that it defines Singaporean identity narrowly in those categories, and it may not be able to sufficiently cope with the greater diversity, the proliferation of different ethnic groups and nationalities that is being represented in Singapore today. And that's why I come back to the point that I started with. When we think about we as a category, right, we shouldn't just limit it to Singaporeans, because Singapore encompasses a greater range of people now. Some of them are temporary migrants, some of them are new PRs, some of them are potential citizens. And when we think about we only in terms of citizens or Singaporeans, it excludes a large proportion of our population, as well as the complexity of the kind of identities that are being represented now. So I'm not saying that the CMIO model has not served us, and it continues to serve us, but are there ways of, perhaps thinking about it in more nuanced ways? Yeah.
Well, I think there are, and it may not be the primacy of government policies then. It is in our communities. If I were to take myself off as a minister, going back to the grassroots, how do I encourage our communities to welcome new citizens, new PRs, and at the grassroots level, come together and build bonds? But these things take time, and many a times cannot be dictated. It takes, like I said, individuals, like all of us in the room, individuals functioning in the community to make sure that the minority, whether it is in race, in nationality, are not pushed out of our lives in Singapore. But I must say that being a Singapore citizen must have its unique privileges. So there must be differentiation. Otherwise, well, it's very difficult to define what is the Singapore state and what are the privileges of being Singaporean as well. So these are some of the things that I suppose we'll have to balance out. Which category would require our closest attention? Who do we encourage to become part of us? And who that sometimes we just don't have the space to accommodate? Those are the realities of governance.
Okay, we have a question over there. Might have to turn the mic on.
It's on. Okay, hello. My name is Perrin. I'm from pink.sg. My question is regarding rights of minority groups like LGBT community and single mothers. Now, we are often told when we are talking about issues that deals with these communities that such issues are polarizing, and it is most practical and beneficial to wait for society to evolve before we can see any change being implemented in our policies. I got two observations. The first one means that protections of such minority interests will only be granted when the majority approves, which kind of defeats the purpose of protecting minorities. And sometimes the time and pace waiting for these change to happen might not keep up with the needs that we need to deal with. Bullying of LGBT students in schools, housing needs, and healthcare needs. My question is, while we are waiting for society to evolve, should the government, or is there a role for the government to intervene, to take steps to protect minority interests in the meanwhile, and to help change misconceptions of such minority communities? Thank you.
Now, there are policies already that are answering to some of these needs, whether single mothers, through MSF policy, to HDB policies, they are answering to these needs. But for the other part of the question you asked about LGBT issues, whether we can come together as a society, well, my basic answer to you again, the space for consensus building in this is small, because the viewpoints are quite opposed. Unlike, well, very much like maybe in the long past, where we're in the midst of racial riots, those viewpoints are far apart as well. So then, can we have the patience to educate, to allow the processes of discussion, of forging common bonds, to move these relationships forward? So there are some things we can draw from history, slightly different context, but nevertheless with the same texture. So in some things, really the best way forward is to allow it to evolve. Society changes, each generation have our own outlook in life, own ideals, and whether over time we will find new equilibriums that society in large accepts. So on those two parts, I wouldn't quite put them into the same category. Single mothers with needs for housing, with maybe other needs for us to help with the children, all those I think are spaces that we have more convergence, that we can really design policies. In other areas, we have to let the evolution of time allow the evolution of time so that society can find the new water level.
Sorry, there are quite a few questions, so I'm just going to move on from that. Anne at table 25.
Anne Wee from NUS. Minister, in the interest of further integrating the category of children who are likely to throw up the leaders, can you rethink the SAP school system? Of the parents of a high ability Malay girl tell me she was transferred out of the school when it became a SAP school. One of the young Indian MPs at the alumni giving a speech said his first day in law school he had coffee with two Indians who said, I beg your pardon, with two Chinese who said they had never before ever had a conversation with an Indian. They were having it on that occasion because he spoke Mandarin and he heard them call him a dirty Indian. So he answered politely, so of course they were very upset and they had coffee together. Now, if all these young people had been in school together, it might better integrate the future leadership. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for the comment. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, well, we only start the SAP schools when our kids reach 14. And there are specific reasons why SAP schools is part of our history, to promote the deeper understanding of culture, of heritage, so on and so forth. So there is 6 years where our kids will intermingle. And in the variegated landscape in our secondary schools, well, there will be some cases, like you mentioned, that may well fall in between the policy designs. But by and large, over 12 years, you will have different opportunities to interact, to understand, to grow up together. And if all else fails, if it's a boy, you still got national service. So I understand that the examples you have quoted, well, some of them do have fewer friends from the minorities. But in the process of the whole system, we allow many, many possibilities.
Minister, we have a student who's going to join the conversation here. Can we see the audio that mic is working?
Hello, my name is Fu Ailon from National Junior College, and my question sort of overlapped with the guy just now, so I thought I would just add on some points. My question is, how are we to achieve cohesive identity when groups like single mothers and the LGBT are still marginalized at the edges of society in the sense that they do not achieve the same rights and benefits like childcare benefits or rights to reserve BTO flats. For example, the petition to remove Adam Lambert from the New Year countdown actually attracted 20,000 signatures, and the next day there was actually a counter petition attracting a similar number of signatures. So we can see here that here we have two very different groups with very differing worldviews. On one hand, a group with pro-family values who believe in the nuclear family unit, and the other with a more liberal view towards LGBT rights. So my question is, does the government have a definitive stance on LGBT rights? And how is it going to handle this delicate clash in values? Thank you.
Well, I have no new answer for you because I answered the gentleman. Let society find its watermark. So when you talk about two different groups, as I mentioned, to forge cohesive diversity, do we come into the conversation to force our viewpoint? Or do we come in with the humility and respect also to consider other viewpoints? And at the end of it, how do we look at the decision or the solution as the best way forward? So that after a conversation, especially in policy making, well, we just can't agree to disagree and walk away. It's not just a simple debate, but where we have the luxury of time for evolution. Maybe that is the solution. It will not be satisfactory, especially from a bright young girl like you in the school. Do you say NUS High?
National Junior College.
Okay, so still very technical, science-based education. Well, you want a cause-effect outcome almost immediately. But in the human dynamics of society and governance, sometimes time is a great resource. Don't have to rush it. Let society evolve and take up their own civic conversations to find a new term. As to the single mothers, I do not know whether it's an issue of identity or pragmatic policies. I'll just recount a case to you. I met a single mother just yesterday at the EduSave Awards. I won't mention her name because this is too large an audience. She came up to thank me because we spent 3 months helping her find a roof over their heads with kids. So you can design the best policies. There will always be marginal interfaces with different policies that people that will fall through the cracks. Then how do we as a government, as a public service, come together to answer these unique cases that policy cannot cover? I think if we have more success stories of empathy, where my colleagues in MSF are trying their very best and doing a good job, well, we will be able to share more of these stories. So I have this lady that is moving out of my immediate vicinity to another place. She had tears in her eyes yesterday and asked whether she can come back and see us. Well, I think we'll make a difference. I do not know whether it's an entire difference across different segments of society, but in each case we deal with it with empathy and with the attitude of service. So I will finish the story. This lady, I asked her, because I have another case of a lady who is going through divorce with 3 kids. I asked this first lady, would you mind if I would link you up so that you, now having benefited from the work of the community, share your experiences to provide support, counsel, to work with this lady to answer to her needs. This is what I mean by each one of us has a part to play. It is not between you and the government. It is us as a collective forging our way ahead for the next 50 years. As we stand on SG 51, why I emphasize the pledge? Because there will be many, many thorny issues that we may not have consensus, that we will have to find a way forward. And under this umbrella, what is the space for us to disagree? And society still has the fabric to hold itself together. Or will your generation let all the disagreements fester and pull us apart? That will be your role. Okay?
Thank you. We have a lady over there who's been standing for a while.
Hello. Thank you, Walter, and thank you, Minister.
Hi, Brema.
Thank you, panel. Yes, I'm Brema. I'm from civil society. Sorry about this. I have a question, a suggestion, and an observation. One of the questions that I have, as spoken very clearly by Mr. Janadas about our pledge, it's a 1965-66 kind of finalization. gender is not there, race, religion, language. And I think it is a primary issue when we want to talk about diversity, because in our constitution too, gender is not there. So I would like to hear, that's my question, the views of yourself, Minister. When can gender come in, both into the pledge and into the constitution? The suggestion that I have is, I really think it is my hope that we will really take more seriously, perhaps, the CMIO model. I like what Professor David Chan has said. Maybe we really got to examine it. But I'm also with Professor Elaine Ho, who has said, is this an outmoded model? Not that it is totally all wrong, but how do we need to modify it in a changing society? Plus, on top of that, it is actually quite divisive. We are thinking it brings a lot of equality, but sometimes I think it is quite divisive. The third point that I would like to talk about is CERD, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Singapore has signed it and it's about to be ratified. If we go through the clauses, very clearly equality is mentioned across many spectrums, including foreigners. So I think there needs to be a more serious engagement on this issue, and I like that the topic has got cohesive diversity with a question mark, because it's an oxymoron, really. So how are we really going to engage in this, I think is very important. The last point is,
I think that's quite a bit for the Minister to answer already.
No, not for the Minister, not for the Minister, this is for all of us. I think we are also, as a citizenry, over-relying on the political leaders to give us all our answers. I think we ourselves need to find quite a number of the solutions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I agree. Especially with your last point about political leaders giving all the answers. I preamble it. I would like to hear the views of the rest of you. Because it is not my purview to change the pledge. It is our purview. Do we want to do it? Or does it have enough space that we already assume gender equality in our treatment of our citizens? I don't have the answer. In fact, I will never have the answer for you. Thankfully, you put the last point across that you are looking too much at me for an answer. So you gave me a way out. Because I'm here, like I said, I don't have a position in many specific areas. Because this is not about policy making specifically in this forum. I'm here to listen to your views. And if that is something that Singaporeans want to take up, well, maybe we have a conversation on that. Okay?
Minister, I'm going to put that same question to the panel.
Sorry?
Question to the panel.
I think gender is a bit different from the other minority groupings, because half the world is male, the other half is female. So same for Singapore. Whatever we say about dragon year babies, it's still about half. So I think it is quite important to separate the two, right? In United States, and I happen to do research on some of this about EEO, the Equal Employment Opportunities, because of historical reasons, you tend to put female and minorities together, right? Because traditionally of the glass ceiling and biases. And the spirit of it is meritocracy and lack of biases. But psychologically and sociologically, female as a group is quite different from minority groups. And earlier I gave the example of Women's Charter is to highlight the fact that when you don't look at group membership and group differences, certain policy will simply not occur, right? If I stop seeing you as male or female, there will never be a Women's Charter. And my point was, if I stop seeing people as CMIO or using the classification, I will not have HDB quota system. I cannot. And so we need to re-examine and say, what policies do we really want to do away with? Are you sure? That's where I was coming from. But a very quick point about group differences, because it keeps coming up. I think whether it is LGBT or single mother, abortion or other groupings, I think we want to recognize general group differences, disagreement versus value differences that are fundamental. I think the government is in a tough position because we have LGBT groups, say, on one side, and you have, say, religious group on the other side. By the way, you should not classify as are you LGBT or not, because there are many people who are not LGBT who might support, say, one group or the other, right? So don't confuse your position position with your group membership. But when there are value differences, what is important is, can you activate my different social identity? So if you and I disagree on LGBT, I mean, surely you and I are more than our sexual orientations. Are we not also Singaporeans? Do we also not believe in social harmony and respect for human dignity? And if we do, that is, instead of not talking about it, can we talk about it with these parameters in mind? Can we talk about it that the moment it becomes exclusive, why are we stopping the conversation? Because it's threatening social harmony. Why are we continuing the conversation? Because we respect human dignity. So the decision to talk or not talk should be secondary. The core values and fundamentals should drive these value differences.
Elaine, ST. Elaine, as the only lady on the panel, on stage.
Well, I feel a little bit underrepresented here, you know. But I'm pretty sure I can hold my own. So I think perhaps rather than talk about specific identity categories, perhaps to follow up on what David was mentioning about talking about it and our core values. And I'm not sure if I caught fully what you said because the acoustics here are not great. But I think my key point here is that very process of talking, that dialogue, shapes our core values. And so when it comes to diversity and hearing a diverse range of voices, the dialogue is essential. And where I am concerned is that increasingly we either see dialogues sort of becoming very hotly contested, and I think in these cases space for public debate has to be created. But where I'm concerned is where these dialogues are taking place on cyberspace. Because when they take place on cyberspace, it's anonymous, and sometimes the views that are expressed, it tends to be of the vocal minority, and the views expressed are quite extreme. So I feel that going back to education, actually we need to educate our young people to be more competent in airing different voices, different points of views, and engaging in balanced and reasoned debate while remaining open to other people's points of views. I think moving ahead in terms of thinking, how do we cope with the growing diversity? That dialogue is important, but the training that goes behind that dialogue is essential as well. And I think if we talk about the education portfolio, I would like to see our teachers be better equipped to do this kind of diversity training. So we see organizations hiring consultants to do diversity training, and I think that our educators can be better equipped in this respect too, both pedagogically as well as in delivery.
Minister, would you like to pick up the last point about cyber?
Well, very good points made, and if you come back to the CMIO concept, Mr. Ho Kwon Ping is quite exemplary in the discussion over time. I recall him saying about whether we need to nuance away or move away from the CIMO conceptualization. But when he had conversations with his minority friends, well, he heard the views of his friends that would still desire a structured representation in the politics of the day. And he came out publicly and said that, well, his viewpoint was perhaps not the most circumspect. Now that is conversations in forging cohesive diversities. I don't have a position that is consolidated, that is unchangeable. If there are better ways to view things, how can we actually accommodate and find the best way forward for our society? So what David said, I fully agree. At different levels, I was having a conversation with Ms. Ting just now, because she's an expert in identity. How do we see ourselves as an individual, as a father, as a husband, so on and so forth? And actually in different conversations, we assume different identities subconsciously. But if we are aware of bigger imperatives of ensuring that society hold together in some of these thorny issues, then which identity can come forth to galvanize us and not let the disagreements pull us apart. I think that is really the essence of how we see ourselves and the values that we uphold.
Minister, we have one last question over there before we do a wrap-up.
Hi. Hello. Hi. Good morning, everyone. I am just a young person, a young Singaporean. Actually, I just want to point out that I don't think SAP schools begin at 14 years old, and I'm speaking
13.
as someone who went to an all-Chinese primary school. School song was in Chinese. Most of my teachers speak Chinese, so if you don't speak Chinese, you can't survive in the school. Only non-Chinese people was one Chindian boy and one Ang Mo girl, both of whom had to learn Chinese as mother tongue. So I was an all-SAP school kid, and this is an all-SAP school kid from primary school to secondary school, and JC also like pretty much half Chinese. And I would actually like to say, please do away with SAP schools, because I really wish that I had grown up, learned with, played with, and fought with people of different races, and still had the same education and same access to resources that I did in my SAP school education. So that's my first point. My second point is basically that I don't understand why we are constantly congratulating ourselves for the success of the CMIO model and wondering whether we should walk away from it in face of diversity, when very obviously the CMIO model was actually a reductive model to begin with. Singapore has always been diverse. Before 1965, after 1965, we are not getting more diverse. It's just that the old models are no longer working. So isn't it easier, instead of just constantly CMIO, not CMIO, why don't we just look at or learn from the problems of CMIO model and see how we can take this going forward? Because perhaps the reason why a lot of Singaporeans have problems dealing with new alternatives or communities coming into Singapore is simply because we've been programmed, educated to think and reproduce these reductive categories of identity, of relating to one another, instead of being taught or trained or educated or simply sort of socialized to think in terms of individuals relating with one another and having the individual responsibility to relate with each other and constantly think it's not just about me being represented, but who is being left out of any conversation that I happen to be in. And honestly, if the Singapore education system, for all its efficacies, right, if it can be so good at producing a very rational, pragmatic Singaporean citizen like myself, who can still remember every single aspect of the national education syllabus, including things like we ourselves must rely on ourselves to succeed, no one owes us a living, I can memorize everything about the reflections, about all the wars, etc. I think it can also be put in the education system to make us think about all these complexities in identity as well. And it does no good to absolve government, education system of the responsibility and just say, no, it's on the community, it's for you guys to do. So I think that, it's kind of problematic to just reduce it between a false dilemma between CMIO or not. So that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the passionate beliefs. Let me ask you a fundamental question. The issue is born out of a CMIO problem or born out because humans organize ourselves with identities as the root problem? Which one came first? So when we look at this issue, if we assume that CIMO is the root of the problem, then maybe we should do away with it. But when we come together in 1965 or maybe earlier, look at the enclaves that we have in Singapore. Even the Chinese were divided, Hokkien, Teochew, Cantonese, in different enclaves. So while with the luxury of 50 years now, we say that we may need to rethink about the CIMO model. Well, without it, what would have happened? Would we have been able to pull ourselves together? Look at the rest of the world. Look at what's happening around us. So I say this with humility, that of course there are always better ways to do things. But have we done well in the last 50 years to forge such a disparate collection of people in this small little island called Singapore without resources? Don't forget, in the 1960s, we were having difficulties making a living. In your generation, we are in a position of strength for us to have a luxury of such a talk to forge our way forward. And we have the luxury of talented individuals like you that can think, can then come together and find a way forward amidst the different challenges. So I'm quite happy with your viewpoints that may not be in agreement with some of us. That's okay. Let's find our way forward. And this is really the spirit of cohesive diversity. I do not know whether you'll be right in 10 years, 20 years' time. Maybe the CMIO model will be obsolete. But when I look around in this room, for us that are older, how to embrace the youthful idealism that you have, so that we ourselves also don't get too cemented in our viewpoints. As I hear you, I will have to evaluate with the passing of time whether this would become the better way to think about things. Or should we still continue to lend practical wisdom because we are somewhat older, lived through different things and seen different things. And in that blending, how do we find the diversity, the cohesive diversity as Singaporeans to chart the way forward?
Range of topics, but I think apart from talking about diversity, I want to reflect on what brings us together, what enables us to communicate with one another as a nation, as people who live in Singapore. And part of it is having a common language like English, so that across, different ethnic groups or languages we speak, we're able to communicate. I also want to highlight that I think, what makes Singapore quite unique is that we can afford. We come from a position of strength now. We've done well, I think, in many respects. Other things we can do better. But where we are now is, I think, we can share this common vision of being future-oriented. So in talking about the CMIO model, it has served us well. But moving forward, how can we do better, reflecting on the different perspectives that have been brought in?
Thank you, Elaine. David.
I think diversity is neutral, but actually so is national identity. You can have bad national identity when we are in group because we share a common enemy out group, such as the local foreigner divide. If the only reason that you like me because I'm Singaporean is because we have a common enemy, that is not going to work. So the important part of national identity, I think, is actually dealing with the differences to emerge and based on the common set of values. And the way I think that what we are relatively lacking, we are okay on meritocracy and other things, social harmony. What we are relatively lacking is social resilience, and because we haven't had many setbacks. And the idea here is that when we quarrel, when we fail, when we have unmet expectations, could we still adhere to some of our common values and say it is okay, let's bounce back? I think that part of the social resilience we have not really quite been tested enough. And so some of these little argument and messiness maybe need to occur under some controlled conditions so that you can have some kind of a resilience. I'm not saying that please create a riot, don't misquote me. What I'm saying is that when there are messiness, actually there can be goodies out of messiness if you know how to manage it. And for that to happen, understand that sometimes we need to annoy each other. Government may annoy you, but government needs to know that we might annoy the government as well.
Thank you, David.
Well, the government won't ignore you. We listen. Well, it's a very good discussion in my view. At the end of it, cohesive diversity, again, is not just about the ideation in our conversations, but subsequently, after we leave this room, how would we behave as individuals, as leaders in society, as young people in society that will forge the way forward? When we talk about social diversity, our pledge can be copied around the world. Any country can download our pledge, modify it, and say that this is the vision. But why is it unique to Singapore that we have succeeded? It requires a clear vision to galvanize people together, but it also requires unity of action amongst all of us that agree that this is the broad vision we want to go forward under, whether it's a banyan tree, tambusu tree, that is flowered with orchids of different variations. How do we chart the forward to accommodate all the different viewpoints? That environment, the unity of action is essential. And I put it as a concluding remarks that the trust between the government and the people, the trust that my generation will have to earn in terms of integrity, competence, and ability. And hopefully over time, our track record also will be able to be put together that we will continue to enjoy this relationship where inclusive politics would be a necessary environment where we have all these different diverse viewpoints, agreements or disagreements. And in that conversation, derive the energy, derive the strength to position Singapore forward for SG 100. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Walter Fernandez. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of MediaCorp, and that's it from this session. Thank you very much.